At 30,000 feet over a stretch of ocean so dark it looked endless, Captain Ethan Cole expected another uneventful night. His bomber had been in the air for hours, following a route that had been flown countless times before. No sudden turns, no surprises, just a straight line through contested skies where every movement was watched. The mission wasn't glamorous. In fact, the entire point was to look boring, predictable, professional, the kind of flight nobody could reasonably complain about. But sometimes, the nights that start the quietest end up being remembered for entirely different reasons. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't visual. It was a tone. A sharp electronic warning suddenly cut through the cockpit. Every crew member recognized it instantly. A radar had locked onto them. Ethan looked down at the display. One contact. Fast. Very fast. The aircraft was still dozens of miles away, but it was closing rapidly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The bomber continued forward. That decision might sound simple, but it wasn't. When another aircraft is racing toward you at hundreds of miles per hour, every instinct tells you to move. Change course. Create distance. Show caution. Instead, Ethan kept flying straight. The reason was simple. The first pilot to react often loses control of the story. And tonight, someone else was trying very hard to write that story. Minutes later, the contact finally appeared on their sensors in enough detail to identify it. A fighter. Not just any fighter. One of the most advanced aircraft regularly flown in the region. Powerful engines. Long-range missiles. Highly trained pilot. The kind of aircraft designed specifically to challenge bombers like Ethan's. But something about the approach felt strange. The fighter wasn't maintaining a safe distance. It wasn't simply observing. It was coming closer. Much closer. Inside the bomber, the atmosphere shifted. Nobody panicked. Nobody shouted. Yet every person on board understood the same thing. The next few minutes would matter. The fighter emerged from the darkness below them. At first it looked almost beautiful, a silhouette rising through the night sky, twin engines glowing like molten metal. Then Ethan noticed the closure rate. The pilot wasn't slowing down. For a brief moment, the fighter appeared directly beneath them. Closer, closer, and then impossibly close. The entire aircraft flashed underneath the bomber. So near that several crew members later struggled to believe what they had seen. Then the turbulence arrived. The wake from the fighter struck the bomber like a hammer. The massive aircraft rolled violently. Warning systems activated. One engine stumbled. For several seconds, the situation balanced on a knife edge. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of aircraft fought against physics. Ethan gripped the controls and forced the bomber level again. The fighter vanished ahead. Silence returned, but only briefly, because now everyone understood something important. This wasn't an ordinary intercept. This was deliberate. The fighter pilot wanted a reaction. The question was why. Most people imagine these encounters as contests of speed or courage. In reality, they're often contests of information. And that was something the fighter pilot didn't seem to realize. Every second he remained nearby, he was broadcasting details about himself. His radar, his communications, his flight patterns, his habits. The bomber wasn't just being observed. It was observing right back. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because while the fighter believed he was pressuring the bomber crew had quietly started collecting something potentially more valuable than any dramatic photograph or aggressive maneuver. Knowledge. The kind of knowledge military planners spend years trying to obtain. The kind that can change future encounters. Yet the fighter kept coming. Again and again. He settled beside the bomber. Holding position. close enough to see details on the fuselage, close enough to remind everyone on board that a mistake from either aircraft could become fatal. From the fighter pilot's perspective, the message was obvious. Look how close I can get. Look how much control I have. Look how vulnerable you are. But messages only matter if they're understood the way you intend. And the bomber crew was reading a completely different message. Every adjustment of the fighter's throttle revealed information. Every maneuver revealed information. Every transmission revealed information. Without realizing it, the pilot was turning himself into a living demonstration. Then something happened that nobody in the fighter cockpit noticed. A second bomber began slowly changing position. Not dramatically, not enough to attract attention, just a gradual movement. A few feet, then a few more, minute after minute, invisible if you weren't specifically looking for it. The fighter never looked. His attention remained fixed on the lead bomber, which meant he was slowly developing a dangerous blind spot. The kind of blind spot that doesn't feel important at first. The kind that only matters later. Much later. The pilot wasn't finished. If anything, he seemed frustrated. The close pass had failed. The intimidation hadn't worked. The bomber crews remained calm. So he escalated. The fighter dropped below the formation, disappeared briefly into darkness, then surged upward again. This time the maneuver was different, more aggressive, more deliberate. The fighter positioned itself beneath the bomber and blasted hot exhaust toward its engines. Inside the cockpit, warning indicators immediately responded. Engine performance fluctuated, temperatures spiked. For a few tense seconds, the bomber lost critical thrust. Anyone watching from the outside might have expected panic. There was none. The crew focused on procedures, corrections, recovery. Within moments, the engines stabilized. The aircraft remained on course, and the fighter achieved exactly nothing, except revealing even more about himself. By now, the encounter had become something strange. Two sides participating in the same event. Yet each side believed something completely different was happening. The fighter thought he was demonstrating dominance. The bomber believed it was gathering intelligence. Both were convinced they were succeeding. Only one of them could be right. The pilot pulled away once more, then lit his afterburners. Power surged. The aircraft accelerated, and for the first time all night, several crew members exchanged concerned glances, because the fighter wasn't preparing another pass. He was preparing something bigger. A vertical climb. Fast, aggressive, risky. The kind of maneuver that looks spectacular when it works, and terrifying when it doesn't. The fighter began climbing beneath the bombers. Straight upward. Burners blazing. The nose pointed toward the sky. Energy bleeding away with every second. There is a moment during any steep climb when commitment becomes irreversible. When turning back becomes harder than continuing. The pilot crossed that point. Still he climbed. Still he accelerated. Still he believed he understood the geometry around him. But he didn't. Because of the second bomber, the one he had mostly forgotten, the one he never properly tracked, the one quietly occupying a piece of sky he assumed was empty. The realization came late. Dangerously late. As the fighter reached the top of the climb, the second bomber suddenly appeared where the pilot least expected it. Not far away, not comfortably separated, close enough to completely destroy his plan. For a split second, the situation transformed. The hunter became trapped. Every exit path looked wrong. Dive one direction and risk crossing a bomber's path. Dive another and encounter turbulent air. Climb higher and lose energy. Turn too sharply and lose control. The pilot had spent the entire encounter trying to pressure someone else. Now he was the one searching desperately for options. Time compressed. Distance disappeared. Decisions had to be made instantly. Finally, he rolled hard and escaped through the only opening he could find. The fighter dove away, engines screaming, altitude disappearing beneath him. Within seconds, he was gone, back into darkness, back into cloud, back into safety. The encounter was over, or at least the flying part was. The bombers continued forward, same heading, same mission, almost as if nothing had happened. Yet something had happened, something neither side would fully understand until much later. The fighter pilot probably returned home believing he had sent a message. Perhaps he believed he had demonstrated confidence. Perhaps he believed he had challenged a rival power. Perhaps he believed he had won. The bomber crews landed with a different perspective, because they weren't thinking about who looked stronger. They weren't thinking about who flew closer. They weren't thinking about who appeared more aggressive. They were thinking about everything they had learned. And that creates an uncomfortable question. In a world obsessed with appearances, who actually wins these encounters? The pilot who creates the dramatic moment everyone notices? Or the crew that quietly walks away with information nobody else can see? Most people would choose the first answer. It's easier, more exciting, more obvious. But history has a habit of rewarding the second, because power isn't always measured by what happens in the sky. Sometimes it's measured by what you understand afterward. And if that's true, then the most important part of this entire encounter wasn't the close pass. It wasn't the engine surge. It wasn't even the near collision. The most important part may have been the information exchanged without either side fully realizing its value. Which leaves one final question. If two rivals can experience the exact same event and walk away believing completely different stories about who won, then how often does that happen in the rest of the world without any of us noticing?